them as he goes through, depending on what is most kind of efficient and effective. Do keep your camera on if you're happy to. It's nice to see some faces as we're presenting in this online fashion, but if you're not, that's fine. And if you don't want to appear in the recording, then of course keep your camera off. We're going to close at 2, as I've said. Yeah, I think that's all the kind of guidance that I was going to share. So just moving on, without further ado, to introduce our speaker to you today. I'm absolutely delighted that Matt Rayner, the Director of Intelligent Metrics, can join us today. And Matt's worked in the sector for many years at a number of different institutions, including post-92s, indeed formerly here at the University of Brighton many years ago, before he moved on to other institutions, including at least one in London as well. And Matt established Intelligent Metrics in 2009 to compile the Guardian University Guide, and has done so every year since. As well as this, he's been a long-time supporter of the HEIR network, attending his first conference in 2014 at Oxford Brookes. And in his words, he's loved it ever since. So much so that he joined me last year as the co-chair of the planning group. And Matt has always had a great interest in data and HE metrics. And he previously worked on the development of the value-added scores to illustrate those unexplained gaps in degree outcomes between different student groups. And he took this through with him to the Guardian, and I'm sure we're all going to find out more about that and the other indicators that are in the Guardian guide in a minute. So I'm going to stop there and hand over to Matt. I'll stop presenting. I think, Matt, you've got some slides too, so Matt will just take a moment to get the slides up. So over to you, Matt. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Thanks for that kind introduction. And to those of you who are joining this from the sort of intelligent metrics league table sort of interactions that I have with the sector, I do encourage you to get involved with the HEIR network. It's a lot of fun, and the conferences are brilliant, and we're trying to build more sessions throughout the year around those. Arranging this has been quite difficult for me because I love to go into so much detail on league tables. They are my pet topic, but I don't want to drown you all with technical detail. So some of what I go through today is going to be a bit superficial in detail. I want you to gain an understanding of how the league tables are put together overall, and then we'll use the Q&A later to go into any technical detail that you're seeking. So I'm going to start with an overview, because not everybody here will be very familiar with the Guardian University Guide. I hope you can all see my screen. I'm often amazed by the depth of understanding that some of the people that I correspond with have about the technical detail of the league table. But HEIR as a network covers Ireland as well as the UK, so it's important to make sure that we've all got a common frame of reference. So here's a screenshot of the Guardian University Guide that was released around this time. Well as being released online in this kind of format, there's also going to be a whole magazine pullout. So please go ahead, buy the print version if you can tomorrow. But the basics are, it's an annual publication, ranked in order to help students choose where to study, essentially. If you want to take a look as we go through this, just go to the Guardian website, click education and scroll down a little way, and there it is in all its glory.
Sorry to interrupt you, Matt. We've got a few people in the chat saying they can't see your screen at the moment.
Well, that's weird. It looks like it's sharing from my point of view.
Well, it looks like some people can. And perhaps those people where it's not working, if you could leave and rejoin the meeting, that would be really useful. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so So the objectives of today, I really want you I want to explain the principles of the guide because they underpin the approach we take. They're the reasons we're a little bit different to the other domestic rankings. And then I'm going to explain the methodology. First of all, just the overall flow from the metrics to the subject rankings. A bit about institutional rankings, why we put them together, how they're put together, and then getting into some detail about the individual metrics. That's going to take quite a large chunk of the time, but I want to reserve a lot of time to talk about how you use the rankings within the providers that you come from. First of all, how you go about explaining and reporting the results, assuming that many of you will have that kind of role within your organisations, and then trying to get beyond that and talking about which metrics could really support institutional research within your organisation. Briefly going to talk about affecting the rankings, what you can do to affect the way your institution is represented, and then going into a bit of methodology detail, particularly around changes in the 2022 guide. So if we get through all of that, I'll be happy, and hopefully there'll be plenty of time for questions about some of the more detailed aspects. So the principles of the guide. It starts, of course, as commissioners of the guide from what the Guardian want to see, what they want to represent to their readership, who their audience is, and I'll go through the ways in which this is a slightly different remit to the other domestic rankings. I'm going to spend about 10 minutes on this section. So first of all, the guide is aimed at prospective undergraduates, and it's important to emphasise that it's at undergraduates, especially those who are from a background where HE in the UK is not familiar. That might be because they're residents in the UK whose parents didn't go into higher education at all and don't have that latent knowledge of who offers what and what's good and what's not. It might be because their parents went in the UK for their own secondary education, or it might be international students who don't have the same opportunities as people who are already here to visit institutions and have a sort of familiar starting place from the schools that they go into, etc. We want to reach them at the point in the decision making where they're longlisting options for further investigation. There was a point where we considered trying to go further and try to help students make the shortlist of course options, and we felt that really wasn't where our sort of point of interaction is, our support for decision making is. We want to convey to students who offers the subjects that they're interested in, who looks like they're good at offering those subjects, and where they might go for further information. So that's making the assumption that they already know which subjects interest them, but the encouragement is to go and find out more. So we link to the courses that are offered within the departments that we rank, and expect students to follow those links, maybe go to the open days and do their shortlisting from that point on. A couple of other sorts of principles that are slightly annoying when describing the guide. One principle is the edition year of the guide we release is always one greater than the year in which it is actually published. So tomorrow will be the 2022 guide. I'm going to be trying to be consistent with that, but it takes a bit of effort sometimes. Another sort of principle, and again, it stems from who we're trying to reach, is we want it to be accessible to prospective undergraduates who aren't familiar with higher education already, and certainly not familiar with the detailed metrics that come out of the sector. So a lot of the time we're presenting one thing that's easy to interpret, but what actually is driving the rankings is sort of in the background. It's less visible, but it's a richer statistic. So a good example is the average response from the National Student Survey. An average on the Likert scale is actually a richer statistic than a satisfaction rate, but it's less inherently meaningful to the prospective undergraduate we imagine is looking at the guide. So for that reason, we stick with easy to understand percentages, but behind the scene, you know, if well, the average response is being used, and that has some more nuance to it. So given this remit, are we truly unique in our approach? The other two domestic rankings use very similar data sources. So what makes us different? I think the others, although the others do refer to undergraduate data, their objective is more aimed at all relevant stakeholders, not so much the prospective undergraduate market. So that includes employers, postgraduates, students, and parents, perhaps. It's more about overall institutional prestige. From our starting point in squarely at prospective undergraduates, we take a much more subject-focused approach. So we're all about the subject rankings. We do aggregate upwards to the institutional rankings, and that gets a lot of attention. It gets a lot of clicks. But really, the use case that we're putting this together for is at the subject level. We do seek to account for some latent differences between students using the guide. So if in some cases we need to think about the imagined students who's using the guide and how that might affect the different outcomes that are measured. Also, we don't use a research metric, and that's a key difference to the other domestic rankings. Because the research metrics change so infrequently, they almost act as an anchor in those other publications and keep things a lot more steady. And we want steadiness as well, but without the research metric, it can be a bit more challenging. I'm not really sure if this is unique anymore, but we were the first to really use the course directory in such a way as to take students from those rankings of departments to the courses that lie within them. So the way we approach this is all based around the student life cycle. I've tried to roughly show that here with a few little icons, but for all the major stages in a student's journey, we want to represent the strengths and the weaknesses of each provider, or I should say more specifically, each department, because it's really departments that we're trying to get to. And by department, I mean an offering of a subject by a provider. We want to show those strengths and weaknesses in order to judge which providers are most suitable overall for further investigation by our imagined prospective undergraduate using the guide. So first we see entry standards. So on the basis that learning alongside smart peers will boost one's own learning, it makes sense to represent the aptitude of students within each department that our prospective user might expect to encounter. There is another justification for using this as a metric in a ranking system, and that's based on the dynamics within the HE system, where tariff scores can really be seen as a form of currency, and if students choose to spend that currency at a given department, that department must be more attractive and therefore more valuable and therefore more worthy in higher up the rankings. It makes sense, it hangs together as a justification, but it often receives quite a lot of criticism because of its potential to become self-fulfilling, and also because of the potential adverse incentives it might have for elite institutions who might otherwise want to widen participation. So couple of justifications there. I lean more to the first, which is that there's a benefit to studying alongside other people who have already demonstrated good aptitude. We have, students are interested in, well, they want to receive good staffing. They want to be supported by good facilities. Generally, they want to get support from the organisation. That might mean on the course, but it might also mean the broader pastoral care that will keep them engaged, keep them having a sense of belonging. And of course, teaching quality is a huge part of what prospective undergraduates will be looking for. They probably are interested to know whether they're likely to be successful, whether they're likely to exceed expectations. And most, but not all students will be expecting to be well prepared for life after university, usually in the form of career. So for each of these, these are the essences of what we think our prospective undergraduates are looking for. But we want to draw those factors together and assert, by looking across all of these, which providers are best at delivering that subject, and that's why we want to produce a ranking of departments within each subject. But first, before we can do that, we need to create proxy measures that will we'll use a quantitative measure for each stage of the student journey. And this is where we make that step from what is the essence of what's important to prospective students to something that's more practical and fair to define and measure. So really it's the difference between each factor and our measure that is the thing we seek to minimize, to make it as informative as possible. For entry standards, we use the average UCAS tariff. For staffing levels, we approximate it using a student staff ratio. For facilities, well, we look at what amount of money is being spent on facilities. If students are well supported, we feel they'll be more likely to continue their studies, and we have an index to measure that. We use the National Student Survey to measure 3 different aspects of teaching quality. So feedback on teaching delivery, feedback on assessment and feedback, and overall course satisfaction. Our value-added scores measure the extent to which students exceed expectations in terms of their degree classifications, only treating firsts and 2-1s as a positive degree outcome. And we use the career prospects metric that's based on the Graduate Outcomes Survey to look at what occupations and activities students are undertaking 15 months after they graduate. So that's all brought together to produce one subject ranking, and that feeds in alongside 53 other subjects to produce the overall institutional rankings, and that has to take certain factors into account, such as how big each subject is. So that in a very small nutshell is the approach we take to compiling the university guide. Before I go into the more technical presentation, are there any questions at this stage? Okay, I'm going to therefore go into the more detailed presentation. So,
Matt, somebody's just, yeah.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, do you want to come in with your question, Matt?
Yeah, just to clarify, you said there was no research metric, so the whole, institutions have got a really strong research reputation and do well in the ref, that's all out the window. That's not part of it.
That's an excellent question. Not directly, no. We've looked into this in the past, and some students feel that in a research intensive institution, the staff are more engaged in research and have less time for undergraduate students in particular. So with that sort of view out there, we didn't want to say research, this department's great for research, so you're gonna thrive there. There are additional benefits to doing research. I mean, not least to the prestige of the department and the knock-on effects that has on the career prospects of a student. But if that's the case, we would expect it to affect the different stages of the student life cycle. So it would manifest through the career prospects. It certainly manifests through the resources as well. I mean, the levels of expenditure in research intensive institutions are huge by comparison. So yes, there would be indirect benefits of studying in a research intensive department, and we would hope that those would manifest through the metrics that we do use.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to seamlessly switch screens and presentation format here. I hope you can all see this screen. Let's just get myself organized. Okay, I'm ready to go. So this is where I get a bit more into the compilation approach. So three stages to talk through, and they feed into each other. We start with metrics, which we have to specify, and largely we purchase them from JISC, who nowadays handle the data that institutions submit to HEIR. We receive all of that data. We have to process and validate the data to get reliable metrics at the subject level. We pull those together. We determine who's delivering which subject and who delivers it enough to generate enough data to support a reliable ranking. Then we take each metric within that subject, we standardize it against sector averages, and we weight and combine the different metrics to produce a total score. That total score determines the subject rankings, and that really is the crux of this, as I was saying. This sort of subject ranking that you can see here is really the primary objective of what we're trying to provide to the prospective undergraduate market. Institution rankings get a lot more attention. A broader readership generally. It's not just the prospective undergraduates who will refer to this. So we want to produce that as well. We take the output from the subject process and we feed it into the institution rankings by weighting for the different subjects, and we also bring in average scores for the different metrics, but they're there almost cosmetically, and that enables us to produce an institution ranking, which most of the headlines will tend to focus upon this, most of the comments, most of the attention from non-prospective undergraduates. So this is the broad approach that we take, and I'm going to go into each section in quite a bit more detail, but maybe not all the way. So first of all, the mapping specification, we have to specify data so that JISC can process HEIR data and sell it to the Guardian. In order to get the right data, it has to be preceded by a subject mapping exercise. So we have a default mapping that says a unit of subject will be represented in one of our 54 subjects in a certain way, but we want to give institutions some opportunity to say that doesn't really work for us. We deliver electrical engineering within our computing science department. We don't actually offer electrical engineering as a subject, for example. So we pick that up through a mapping exercise, and we define the metrics as well. I mean, they tend to be constant from one year to the next, but we adjust them if necessary each year, pass them to JISC as a commission for them to produce the statistics back for us, and that's the granularity of the data we receive and the basis for all of our subsequent compilation efforts. Sorry, I should have been clicking through to these. Sorry, back on the mapping exercise, providers have an opportunity at this stage to say which subjects they do and don't offer. There's some of you will be familiar with cost centres, which is the sort of resource units that institutions report their staff in and their expenditure into. We ask institutions to indicate which cost centre should be associated with each subject. Essentially, we've got HEIR codes going into GSG, Guardian subject groups, as a many-to-one mapping, and for cost centres, it's a one-to-many mapping, because some cost centres, the cost centres are a broader unit than Guardian subject groups are. So then, yes, I'm going to go into the full detail of the different metrics, metric definitions a bit later, but essentially we have to provide those definitions to JISC so that they can produce them for each Guardian subject group and each cost centre. We don't only refer to JISC. HEIR finance data nowadays is open data, so we get it directly from the website whenever it's released. National Student Survey results are already open data from the OFS, and HEIR hold the key information set, which underpins what was the Unistats website, now Discover Uni. We grab that underlying data and we use it in our guide. Not for performance, I should say, on the key information set. We only use it to represent the courses. I can see a question about research-based income. Do we exclude it? Not if it's reported within a academic cost center, no. So if you have enormous telescopes in your, I don't know, physics cost center, that would be included as high expenditure. I like to come back to telescopes as a go-to example of high expenditure in the data that we receive. Mapping and specification. So next is processing and validating. So we receive all of this data from JISC. It needs varying degrees of handling. Some of it needs just to be summarized. Some of it needs to be filtered. Some needs to be combined across many years because we want to average over many years for the sake of stability. By far, the largest element of the process is testing the credibility of the data we receive, corresponding with the institutions and fairly correcting what look like invalid data points. If it weren't for that stage of the process, the whole thing could probably be done in a week. But it's handling that fairly that is the challenge. So that gives us a set of metrics that we can depend upon. And the next stage is to feed those up to the subject level. So first we have to determine which departments should be represented within each subject ranking. So we have to pull together all the various pieces of subject data. Most are compiled at the Guardian subject group level already, and so is the populations that we use. So we refer to the full-time first degree population. And we need to look at as well whether any providers have requested that they be excluded from an individual subject. So for example, they might say, you're going to receive a load of data about modern languages from my provider, but it's only ever offered as a minor option. We don't want to be ranked as if we were a provider of modern languages. The National Student Survey results take a lot of mapping to get them to Guardian subject group level, and the student staff ratio, the spend metric, and the overall student FTE are all based at cost center level. So as I said, we have to associate each Guardian subject group with a single cost center, and that single cost center can be used in multiple different subject groups. So we gather all that together, and then we apply these population thresholds that say you need to have 35 students offering 35 full-time first degree students taking a subject in order to be considered for representation, and that over the years has seemed to be our sweet spot between having a substantial enough cohort to say, you know, this is a provider. They must also be associated with a cost center in which at least 25 FTE of students are taking modules. Full person equivalent would say, you know, if you did have your student taking your French as a minor subject, they might only be a 0.25 FPE, and they would count that towards this threshold. If they were taking a couple of modules in French, they might also have an FTE of 0.25. I'll move on, but I can take questions about that sort of detail later. Although we have these thresholds based on population, it's actually more common for a department, for a provider of a subject not to be included in the rankings for a given subject because of metrics that they're missing. So we have some tolerance for missing data. Some of the metrics we use, in particular the graduate outcomes survey, don't have enough respondents to always be present. So you'll see the career prospects metric often be missing, and we don't want to exclude, from what a prospective undergraduate can see, an entire department just because not enough students responded to a certain survey. So as I'll come to later, each metric is always carrying a weighting. If some metrics are missing, we add up the weighting associated with those missing metrics. If it exceeds 40%, we say that there's just not enough for us to be able to fairly say that one provider of, or this provider of a subject is any better or worse than anyone else. If up to 40% is missing, then we use a substitution process to ensure that they still have a ranked position. So we determine participation, and then for those departments that are going to be ranked, we bring in all their metrics and we calculate the mean and the standard deviation for those metrics that are going to be used, and we standardize against those. As I said, there's a substitution process that brings in an appropriate standardized score for each missing metric. So if you are missing that career prospect score, for example, we won't display that we're assuming it's 67% employment rate or whatever, but behind the scenes we'll have made some sort of assumption, and that assumption varies. If the provider had that metric the preceding year and they would say, I don't know, half a standard deviation above the sector mean, we would assume that this year also they would be half a standard deviation above the sector mean. We don't show what that means to the prospective undergraduate, we just plug the gap with the standardized score. If there was no data point from the preceding year, which in the case of career prospects there wouldn't be, we refer to whether or not the missing metric correlates to the other metrics in that subject. So if we found, well, career prospects is it totally correlates to everything else because of its connections to entry standards and to value added scores, we say, okay, well, they've done this well in all the other metrics combined, so we assume they would have done that well as well in what was missing. But if there is no correlation, we assume the sector average, which is a standardized score of 0. Here again, I should mention that many of our metrics have something other than the raw statistic displayed. So I already mentioned NSS scores, where we display a percentage, but we're actually working from an average response. For value-added scores and for expenditure, we go further. We convert it completely into a point scale, 1 to 10, which again sort of obscures some of the detail from those who would enjoy working with that detail, but it makes things a bit more meaningful, a bit more accessible to the prospective undergraduates using the guide. So we've got a load of standardized scores for each metric within each department that's going to be ranked in a subject. At this point, the time now is to bring those together by weighting them all and using weighting them and bringing them together into a total weighted standardized score. So I'm not sure if I actually detailed this later, but we've got percentages like 15% for the entry standards. I do mention it later. There are different weightings for all the metrics, and we use those to total them up. What we get from that is an average standardized score that varies from about -1.5 to +1.5. It's not nice for a prospective undergraduate to look at. So we rescale it to make sure that all institutions have a positive score and the top provider scores 100. It looks a bit like a percentage. It's not a percentage at all, but hopefully it's that much more meaningful for the people using the guides. And rankings are produced from those totals. So that's how we do it. But we never really refer to those total point scores of 0 to 100 again. We really stick with the weighted standardized scores, which are the essence of the performance, and those are what we feed into the institution rankings. So there's two factors that are used to weight this. Firstly, so we need to take those weighted standardized scores from the subject level, and we need to weight them again in a couple of ways to get them ready for usage in the institutional table. Firstly, the population in the subject. Secondly, the number of providers who offer that subject. I think it's obvious why we need to do the population in the subject. If you do an absolutely brilliant in, say, American studies, and you only had 50 students taking it, that shouldn't matter as much as doing absolutely awfully in business where you've got 1,000 students taking it. A couple of points of detail here is it's not a straight proportion of your total first degree full-time population. The denominator is only that population that appears somewhere in the ranking. So if you had a big subject that you were absent for, it wouldn't make any difference. A little bit less obvious is why we refer to the number of providers in a subject. My go-to example here is from many years ago, actually, but we were puzzling over why Bristol had dropped massively in the rankings one year when we realised that they were 6th out of 6 for veterinary science, and that was as damaging to their overall position as another provider being 120th out of 120 for business. And we felt that wouldn't do. You know, it's perfectly plausible. There are 6 brilliant providers of vet science, and we don't need to be so almost penalizing to the bottom institution. So we take the natural log of the number of providers ranked for the subject and use that as a weighting factor as well. So with the weighting applied, all that remains to do is to give each provider their total weighted score, also converting that into the scale that has a maximum of 100. At this point, we do display the university average scores for each metric. So you'll have your overall average tariff, the overall proportion of the students who went into a positive graduate occupation after graduation, but those don't have any direct influence over the ranking positions or the total scores. Those are all an aggregation from performance at the subject level, and at subject level, because of the standardization process, subject differences are being taken into account. So if you've got 95% employment rate in nursing, that's going to affect your overall institutional average. But at subject level, it will have been compared to a mean that's probably around 95% anyway, and said, yeah, well, it's normal, but it will be having an abnormally good effect on the university average. So we've taken those subject factors into account when producing all our judgments of performance and score and suitability and everything else. But those institution averages are not taking it into account. They are just displaying it for what it is. So that's again a slightly more detailed overview of the approach we take to compiling the rankings. That gives us the essence of everything that we produce. If there aren't any questions at this stage, I'm going to go metric by metric into the detail. Finish my tea. So the metrics. As I mentioned before, they draw on the student life cycle and try to measure what would be important to a prospective student at each stage. Another point I want to make, and this is a sort of mantra I've started repeating over the years when negotiating with institutions over what looks like anomalous data. Although the data we purchase from JISC or HEIR describes activity that took place in the past, and if reported correctly is factual, we're essentially trying to use it to predict the future. Our users of the guide are interested in becoming a student in the future, so we want to give them an impression of what they would be likely to encounter if they were to join a certain department in the next couple of years. And that matters a great deal because sometimes, you know, we'll be speaking to a department, they'll say, you know, we've just opened our chemistry department, so, you know, we haven't got many students on there yet, but we bought a whole load of Bunsen burners. And it's true that we're spending, you know, £25,000 per student at the moment for the students that we have. That's factually correct, but we don't want to use that to give an impression to prospective undergraduates now that they'll be having 25k per student dedicated to their provision in a few years' time. So that's yeah, that's something I should mention. So let's go through each one of them. We'll start with entry tariff because it's earliest in the student life cycle. As I said, we're trying to approximate the aptitude of fellow students who a prospective student can anticipate studying alongside. So we report the observed average grades for students who actually joined the department. We're not interested in what the sticker price was in terms of the stated conditions of admission of the course. We limit this to young entrants to full-time first degree courses who are aged under 21 on entry, so 20 or younger. That's not a principled exclusion. It's not because we only want this to be for young entrants. It's just that there's so much greater diversity for mature entrants in terms of how they get admitted that we felt it would give a wrong impression to base it on that diversity. It's much more difficult to make a judgment on a scale. This is only for students with tariffable entry qualifications. So there's a code called Qualent 3 there, which is the highest qualification on entry. So they have to have a Qualent that's in a certain list. That means it's a tariffable qualification. And then we examine the tariffs of the students that are actually been observed. We exclude the non-zero ones. An interesting extra detail that's a bit annoying sometimes because it was asked for by an institution and then left the guide is that if the majority of entrants to a department are mature, we're almost saying, well, it's silly to then use an average that's based on the minority of young students. It can get in the way sometimes. We see a few social work departments in particular lose their entry tariff score because of this extra rule, but generally it doesn't affect many departments at all. Overall, this metric carries a weight of 15% into the overall score. Next up, we have the student-staff ratio. We're seeking to approximate the levels of staff contact that a prospective student can expect to receive, and to do that we divide the volume of students who are taking modules in the cost centre that's attached to the subject by the volume of staff who are available to teach it. So on the student side, we get the full-time equivalent built up from the module level and discounted by the proportion that is delivered by a collaborating provider. So if you have lots of partnership students at your institution, generally they'll have a PICO lab score of 100%. That means that they're 100% taken out of this calculation because there's no expectation that they'll be delivered to by staff who are employees of your organisation. The location of study is used to discount students who are on a type of placement. If it's a full placement, I think it's they're discounted to 20% of their FTE. If it's a partial placement, it's 60%. And on the staff side, we only include staff who have an academic employment function of teaching or teaching and research. The student staff ratio we use is the same as what goes for the normal way of doing it. It should be common across all the different rankings and any official statistics that HEIR ever release on this. There are a couple of standard filters that are applied as well. There have to be 3 or more staff and 28 or more students in order for the SSR to be produced. And again, this metric is worth 15%. Next is expenditure, which is our way of approximating the level of resources that a student could expect to have dedicated to their provision. So again, you know, if they're interested in physics and there's huge telescopes in that department that cost an absolute fortune to maintain, not to buy, because that would be capital, and capital isn't included here. But you know, we would expect that even if they don't get to touch that telescope throughout their undergraduate studies, it's a signal of a well-resourced department, and that there's probably other benefits from that as well. So we look at the total expenditure in each subject area, although we exclude the costs of academic staff from that because they're already contributing to the student staff ratio. And we divide it by the number of students taking the subject. But we also add in centralized academic resources. So the FTE here is exactly the same as for the student staff ratio, but we include any expenditure that's reported under academic services. So that will include computing facilities, centralized learning resources, typically a library, and the costs that sit within academic cost centres, so they're subject-specific cost centres, with the academic staff costs excluded. The way we stitch those together is we create a ratio for the subject unit, and we also calculate a 2-year average for centralised academic resources. So that's divided by the total student population in each of those years. Every subject-specific one has that same central ratio added onto it. I've got a question here about the finance return replaced by a return to the OFS. Don't know. We still get the data from the official HEIR website. So whoever is having to collect the information, it comes out again from HEIR according to the same definitions as has ever been. So we haven't detected any change here. This metric only carries a weight of 5%, and oh, I need to explain the ratio again. I do get a lot of questions about this one, actually. Okay, so we get, say you're in a, let's say you're in a department of English. Let's say you're a department of English. You'd be associated with a cost centre also of English. Maybe this isn't the best example. Let's say you're fashion and textiles as a department. You're associated with a cost centre of creative art and design. Within creative art and design, there's loads and loads of expenditure because you've got your other art subjects in there as well. So let's say you've got 10 million of spend, and overall in that cost centre there are let's try and keep this simple, 1,000 students. So is that 1,000 per student? I'm not doing it well on the fly. So let's say it's £1,000 per student within the academic cost centre. So you've got that from there. But centrally, let's say 10 million is spent on academic services. So that's your library, your overall computing facilities that are aimed at students. Maybe you've got a small museum, or you've got some, a theatre or anything else that can be viewed as an academic service. So let's say you spent 10 million on that centrally this year and 12 million last year. That's 22 million that's spent on the academic services over 2 years. Your overall student population for those 2 years might be 10,000 and 12,000, let's say. So you've got 22 million spent on 22,000 students. I might get the wrong thing here, but let's say that also adds up to £1,000 per student on academic services. So we've got one ratio that's central on academic services for all students across 2 years, 1,000. We've also got a local expenditure for creative arts and design that's also £1,000. That adds up to £2,000, and that would be the score that we would use. I hope that explains it. I wish I'd drawn a diagram for this one. Thanks. Okay. 5% because the data quality on this isn't great. There doesn't seem to be much policing of what people count into the different expenditure categories. I think the only requirement from HEIR / the OFS is that it corresponds to your accounts. Beyond that, so yeah, only 5% there. It used to be more. Continuation rates. This was
sorry. There was a late question about capital expenditure.
Oh, no, you can't add capital expenditure. It would create too much lumpiness in the data. If you fitted out new computing facilities or something, it would have a huge impact one year and then ostensibly not in future years. The way I'm no accountant, but the way that depreciation is handled can show the sort of strength of your facilities in a way that would shine through recurrent expenditure. Okay, continuation. So usually, some students struggle, and it's wasted for everyone if they discontinue their studies. Providers can do a lot to support their students, either on the course itself or through general care, help with engagement, the broader higher education experience generally. So we want to try and capture how successful each department is in achieving this, but there are clearly some factors in higher education that aren't always within an institution's control. So the higher propensity for mature students to drop out isn't because of the way that mature students are delivered to. It's about the other things that go on in people's life when they've got other responsibilities generally. Someone might disagree with me on that, but in any case, there is that higher likelihood of mature students dropping out. There's also the factors associated with previous educational attainment. That means that some students are naturally more likely to struggle at a higher education level. So we didn't want to just take this in. I should also note that this is a metric we introduced much later. It's only been around with us for about 4 or 5 years, and it was the missing piece in the puzzle for many years. What we wanted was some measure of degree completion, because we wanted to capture that drop off between students starting a degree and ultimately not fulfilling it. We don't think there's a good way of measuring that in a practical way at a subject level, because you'd have to make too many judgments about what the expectations for different cohorts are, etc. So we've gone with the first year continuation model. It's different to the official performance indicators. The official performance indicators are all about entrance to higher education. This is about first years in higher education. There's a subtle but important difference there. So we define our population according to first years on full-time first degree courses that are scheduled to take longer than a year to complete. They're not necessarily always new entrants, so we'll include in there students that have repeated their first year. So we might have, if a student joined a course and the next year they were taking that first year again, they would count once as a positive outcome because they were retained. That's common with the other definitions of continuation and retention. But then we would differ to the others, and we would count them again in that denominator. And if they then dropped out, they would count negatively in the second year because they would not be found in the third year. We also exclude foundation year students from that. It's we're trying to say of the cohort who are taking level 4, what proportion are retained and active somewhere in higher education the following year. Again, this is a metric where we display something that's meaningful, which is the proportion of students who are still in higher education the year after their first year. But behind the scenes, we're using something more complex, more difficult to understand, and that's as it should be. So bit more detail here in how we calculate a continuation index. Similar in concept to the value added score, it compares a student's observed rates of continuation with a sense of expectation, which is based off their entry profile and their age. So first of all, the first instruction to JISC, who calculate this on our behalf, is for every first year student in the sector, what proportion were not inactive the following December. That doesn't necessarily mean they progressed, they just were somewhere in higher education the following December. We didn't shift to the HEIR one that is like it can vary for different times of the year. We stuck with the December census on this. We've got these entry qualification categories which are built on tariff, on grade, and on young or mature. We don't use all three all the time, but there's a large number of categories that we've put students into. So for each one of those categories, we say, right, well, there's this many students out there in the sector who could be described in this way. What proportion of those were not inactive the following December? That proportion, which we cap at 97%, is the expectation that we will then place on every student like that throughout the sector. So then looking within a department, we'll put those expectations next to it and every single one of those students. If they do continue into their next year after their first year, they scored the reciprocal of that expectation. So if it was a 95% expectation, they'd score 1 divided by 0.95, which would be a shade over 1. If they were if they had the worst possible profile, they had like a 50% expectation of continuation. I don't think that exists for any of the categories, thankfully, but they would then be scoring 2 if they did indeed continue into the first year. If they didn't continue into the next year, they score 0. When you average it up, all of those indices, you get an average index that makes sense across the department. Anything above 1 is good, anything below 1 is beneath expectations. Similar approach to the value added scores, which we've used successfully for many years, but maybe not as well suited because fewer students drop out of higher education than the proportion who get a first or 2-1. So in order to make it work, in order for there to be enough space for people to exceed expectations and to really judge this, we had to aggregate it across 2 years. So there's quite a high threshold. It's the highest threshold. We need 65 students in a denominator before we're ready to say, yeah, we can judge this. We can look at that continuation index and pin our judgment onto it and say it's good or it's bad. So we don't want to exclude too many departments. So we sometimes use a 3-year average. If there were 35 in the 2 most recent years, and by adding a 3rd year, you get to the 65 threshold, but it's quite a high threshold. Question here about the Pico Lab. No, that Pico Lab thing is only for those resource metrics, and the reason for them is that we're not systematically seeking to exclude partnership students or franchised students. They're in this guide. They're in the NSS results. We use the registered ones. So we don't seek to exclude them from the continuation metric at all. If you've got a partnership provider associated with you and lots of their students are dropping out, that will affect your overall performance in the subjects concerned. The reason we do exclude them from those research metrics, it's not a principled view, it's a practical view. It's because the boundary around which staff are included in the student staff ratio is who's in the HEIR return for staff, and that refers to who's who's an employee of the provider to the extent that they're making national insurance contributions. That generally, with no exceptions that I know of, won't include the staff who are delivering via a provider or through a provider. So because they're excluded, we have to exclude the students who they're teaching to. Yes, we do include the foundation year students. I've had a slight wobble in my confidence on that. I'm pretty sure as I was presenting, you might have seen me stutter on that because I forgot a little bit, but I'm pretty sure we designed it so that we get the students at level 4 proper. I think we use year prog, so year of program 1 in our definition. So if your foundation year students are becoming year of program 1 in your reporting when they reach the first year of the degree proper, then yes, they are included. So that's how the continuation index works. Here's an example of what it might look like in terms of the statistics. So we'll have 3 years of data for this provider. Let's say for the 17-18 data, 92.6% of the students did continue after their first year. The expectation built up by pinning the expectation on each and every one of those students was 90.8%. So therefore you expect a continuation index that's above 1. Not actually guaranteed, because this continuation index isn't as simple as saying 92.6% divided by 90.8%. You'd expect it to correlate pretty strongly, but it's actually being based off the individual student. So it does depend which of the students did you lose. Was it the ones with high expectation or was it the ones with low expectation? And that can create variation. So the following year, it was very fine. 91.4% did not become inactive a year after being in their first year, against an expectation of 91.5%. So as you imagine, it's just a shade under 1. What we would do is create a big weighted average of these 2 years, as long as the populations in these 2 years add up to 65 or more. If they added up to say 55, we say, okay, we need to bring a 3rd year in. Is that enough? Yes, it is. Okay, we use a 3-year average. It's a complex one. I don't get many questions about this one because I don't think people generally understand it. It's relatively new. It could do with more attention, really. I think it's pretty good. I was meant to zoom in on that. Sorry. Okay. Overall, this is worth 15%. That's up this year. Last year it was only worth 10%. I think in the year we introduced it, it was only worth 5%. We've gradually been increasing it as we get more and more confidence in this metric. For the first time this year, we started using it in the medical subjects. There are 3 medical subjects in the guide, which we have to use the metrics slightly differently for. Satisfaction next. We have 3 metrics depending on this. And those are teaching quality, assessment and feedback, and overall course satisfaction. The weighting profile for this, you can see now, adds up to 20%. Last year it was 25%. We reduced it from 10-10-5 this year, as I'll explain later, largely because of the disruption to the NSS, both in terms of political support and in terms of the weird results. So we're looking at full-time first degree respondents to the National Student Survey in either of the last 2 years. As mentioned just before, is registered respondents, not just ones that are taught by your institution. And we also get from JISC an approximate NSS population split out by HEIR code, which we use for weighting purposes. So that's like an approximation of the final year population who you'd expect to have been invited to respond to the survey. I could go on for about half an hour, 40 minutes on exactly how we connect NSS results to Guardian subject groups. It's pretty convoluted. I'm not going to do that. Okay, either of the last 2 years. We used to only use the most recent year of results. So in the survey, in the rankings that we published in 2019, we'd have been referring to the 2018 NSS. We would have published in May or June 2019, and we'd have been referring to NSS results that had been released in July 2018. So they were almost a year out of date. Last year, we had to shift to September because of the pandemic, which meant that instead of using 2019 results alone, by the time we came to publish, the 2020 results were already available. So we used 2019 and 2020 together, which meant we completely aggregated them. It meant that unlike previous years where we would only refer to the previous year if there was a gap, we were just systematically aggregating everything. And we've done the same this year. So we've used 2021 and 2020 results in aggregate, same weighting across both years. We're not saying one year is more important than the other. The combination process is, as I said, fairly long. It involves getting results from the CAR 3 or CAR 2 or CAR 1 aggregation, making assumptions about what HEIR codes they connect to, and then building up from those HEIR codes with the weighting back up to guardian subject group level. Oxford and Cambridge just miss out because they don't participate in the survey at all. So they're subject to the substitution process, and it means that if they're missing other metrics in certain subjects, they will they do miss out on representation within certain departments. So I think Cambridge is back in with town and country planning this year, but last year it was absent from it, largely because of the boycott of the NSS within those institutions. So overall, this is worth 20%, but I'm aware that I'm skating over this quite superficially, but I'm going to move on. I can come back to questions about how we use NSS data if anyone's interested. Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, I noticed the time as well. Value added scores. In order to assess the extent to which each department will support its students towards achieving good grades, we track the we track the progress they make from enrolment to graduation. So it's very similar to the continuation rate, except that we're defining our population as those who qualified with a classified first degree, taken on a full-time basis, and basically not a top-up course. We exclude the top-up courses through reference to the academic year that they started in. The reason, so we could just do the proportion of students who get a good degree, who get a first or 2-1. But the key determinant of that tends to be what they started with. There's a huge correlation between the two. So we create a similar index. So again, at the sector level, what proportion of students were awarded a first or 2-1? Express that for every entry qualification. Only about 50. It's less sophisticated than the continuation index one. Most of those are based, well, about 25 of them are based on tariff boundaries. Again, we do the reciprocal of the score if they were successful in getting a first or 2-1, 0. Otherwise, we aggregate that. There are some population definitions there. We need 30 in the cohort, and it's a much lower threshold than from that continuation index, largely because good degree rates tend to be lower than continuation rates. Here's an example for one institution of what the scores look like. I think I can zoom this down, yeah. So you can see that these little dashed lines are representing the expectations. So for this category of students who entered with tariffs of 540 or more, this might be going back a few years when we were on that tariff scale. Or no, it's because the students who are qualifying in this year had entered underneath that system. The expectations, as you can see, are sort of well over 90% getting a first and 2-1 for this entry qualification group. So this provider, even though over 90% of their students in that category did indeed get a first or 2-1, it's still a slightly adverse value added score because they didn't quite keep up with expectations. They get a lot more benefit down here in the 60 to 79 category, where the expectations are way lower, somewhere around 70%, because indeed close to 100% of those students got a first or 2-1, the value added score is much higher, and that's carrying a benefit into this particular department's overall scores. Again, there's more complexity to this, but I'm running out of time, and I'll take more technical questions about it later if you have any. Finally, career prospects. Most students will have their future career as a important factor in their decision making. So we use the graduate outcomes survey to illustrate the likelihood of being in a graduate level occupation 15 months after graduation. So we limited our population to respondents who had studied full-time at a first degree level. The respondents included partial respondents. A lot of people in the first year of this survey kind of started it, didn't get all the way. We didn't want to exclude them because we already had a problem with low response rates. So we make a judgment on the type of, if they're employed, what type of SOC code that is, if they're self-employed, what type of SOC code that is, if they're in further study or have been in interim study, what type of qualification did they take? If it's undergraduate or higher, including professional, we treated that as positive. SOC groups 1 to 3 treat positive, same as TEF, other league tables, everything. I didn't change the we didn't want to change all the data. The changes between SOC codes from one year to the next looked minimal, and we didn't want to recommission all the data, go through all the dialogue with the sector just to get these minimal changes. We reused 17-18 data. I should have said that. I'll say it again later as well. We had to reuse the data. The 18-19 data came out late. We might have just about been able to squeeze it in to this year's compilation, but that would have been without any proper check-in. And we felt that, you know, that with everything that's happened to these students, having graduated in 2019 and the pandemic since, we felt that the data would need a whole lot of inspection to make sure it was reliable to use, and we'd have been having to turn around it in days, so there wasn't time for that. So that's why we reused 17-18, but we didn't want to go through the whole validation process again, or indeed repurchase the data. You went up 3%. Yeah, but they revised it. I mean, it was all fair in the year that it was produced. So if people have reclassified SOC codes, it affects everyone in a similar way. I think, I'm not sure if you've got a filter on undergraduates. Sorry, non-UK domiciled students. I'll have to check that and reply later. No, we didn't apply the new SOC codes to 17-18 data. We just kept it as it was when it was released to us. I've got some specifications there, but attaching a PDF didn't give all pages, and it's too technical anyway. But I can go through that if needs be. So I'm 10 minutes over schedule. That is a summary of the metrics in some detail, but as you can tell, each one of those I could bang on about for quite some time. So I'm going to stop there and confirm, yes, the same results as last year are going to be published. Any questions at this stage about the methodology in the level of detail that I've gone to? Oh, thanks. It's UK domiciled only. Thanks, Mark.
Matt, there was one question earlier about on the value added measure and any kind of tension between concerns about grade inflation. Yeah,
I can't see the question, but it's a, oh yes, oh thanks Mark. Tension between value added metric and external concerns over grade inflation. Yeah, I mean, I'm in a somewhat privileged position doing this where I can sort of say we're all about what's right for the prospective undergraduates. The knock-on effects for how institutions react to that isn't our business. I know that's probably divorcing myself from some responsibility, but I think we've got a duty to our prospective undergraduates to say these are the providers that will support you most to get a good grade, and of course we want that good grade to be meaningful across the system. We don't want grade inflation, otherwise it will become meaningless. But at the same time, you know, there are employers who will sift through and say first, or 2-2, no, not having that one, and you know, they'll sift the CVs that they receive. So it is important to prospective students that they have a good chance at doing well. So that's the extent of our thinking. Beyond that, it's not our responsibility to be maintaining the standards. I do appreciate that. Yeah, it does create an extra incentive for institutions to inflate grades, and indeed we do see it come through the data. You know, sometimes we're always examining those institutions that hop up the rankings in any one year and try to say, well, is there a good reason for this change? And sometimes it is that they've just leapt up with their first and 2-1s, and it's unfortunate, but I think the answer to that needs to be in checks and balances in the sector rather than in us ignoring student success as a factor as if it wasn't important to prospective undergraduates, because it is.
Thanks, Matt. There's a couple about career prospects, probably about low response rates. Someone's saying they've got 11 departments where they're under your cutoff point, so yeah, they're not shown. But are they included in the overall figures?
They'll be included in the overall figures, but those overall figures won't have any influence over their ranking position or their total scores. The only thing I would say, there was a rule that came out of the data that we weren't allowed to publish the percentages if it was based on a population of 22.5 or fewer. Our threshold we reduced to 20. So there's an extra category of student in there, or of department, where it's based on between 20 and 22.5. So we can't display the score, but we are actually using it behind the scenes. But if it's less than 20, then no, we're just not using it.
And then someone asking whether 2 years of the graduate outcomes data would be used.
Certainly not during a pandemic. Back in 2008, 2009, around that period, we ruled out ever doing that because we were seeing such massive differences as a result of the global recession. I imagine as we come out of pandemic, it's going to be similar circumstances where the environments that graduates are moving into are so different from one year to the next that you'd be penalising or advantaging departments based on which years of data you were referring to and how big their responses were in each of those 2 years. So it would be a dangerous thing to do. But on the other hand, last year it was quite uncomfortable using the graduate outcomes data because of its holiness. I don't mean that in a reverential way. I mean, it has lots and lots of holes in it. We had to do some workarounds last year to say, like, there were certain subjects where, you know, there was, like, I think in history of art, there was one department in the whole country that had a graduate prospect score. So we couldn't standardize that because it'd be standardized against itself. So we had to create broader subject categories and say, if there aren't enough, we have to standardize more broadly. But it is a problem. It is a problem. Do we use salary as a measure of graduate outcomes? No, never have done, and the Guardian are fundamentally opposed to doing so. We had the Leo data pushed upon us quite a bit by the DFE, and you know, there's fundamental opposition to using them.
Matt, have you got more presentation? Like, there's quite a lot of questions coming in. So do you want to carry on with your presentation and then we'll pick up all of the questions at the end? Or
thanks, Rachel. Yep. Okay. Hang on. I just need to shift gear. Okay, so okay, so now I'm going to talk a bit about the utility of the rankings within providers to help you explain the results to your colleagues, to help use the tables as a wider context to institutional performance, and touch upon how metrics can support institutional research. First of all, some do's and don'ts really about explaining institution results. I've got 4 main takeaways that I'm going to go through in more detail. First of all, performance is not our objective when we're compiling this guide. I don't have a good word for it. The closest word I can think of is suitability. We're trying to inform student choice by providing a scale of suitability. Could do with a better word. So if anyone has an idea, that's great. But the point is, it's not performance. There's a subtle difference. Another one is don't start with the institution metrics. That's going to be hard because your vice chancellors, if you ask your vice chancellor, they're going to want to know how they did as an institution and why, but it's not the starting point for analysis. Try and get the conversation to a subject level as quickly as you can, and try and understand the influence of each data point if you've got the time. So first of all, the distinction between performance, quality, suitability. Why aren't they all completely interchangeable? And they are somewhat interchangeable. Some of the metrics we use are input measures. They don't indicate performance or quality. So your executive would love to perform terribly in two of the metrics. They'd as long as they were performing well in everything else, they'd like to have quite a high student staff ratio and quite low spend per student statistics. Because a provider could waste money and over-resource its academic staff base and do well in this measure without necessarily supporting its students well. So most metrics are output measures, though, and I think I would expect most universities to prize the outcomes that they're seeking to approximate, but that's probably not universally true. Also, most metrics have no benchmark or expectation. So by this I mean that with the exceptions of the value-added scores and the continuation, we're not trying to distinguish latent advantage from high performance. So most HE metrics of performance come with a benchmark, and those are essential to any assessment of performance. Those benchmarks are basically designed to account for the latent advantage that one provider might have over another in terms of the outcome measures that describe performance. Usually those are with reference to the students that the provider caters to. So if they're extremely privileged students and they're all extremely well qualified for higher education, it shouldn't be a pat on the back for that particular provider if they go into good jobs afterwards. That's a latent advantage of the institution, and it's an important consideration if your objective is to measure performance. But we're squarely aimed at informing student choice. So we're in a position where we can ignore those factors through the justification that if our imagined user of the guide manages to get into that extremely privileged organisation, then they themselves are going to benefit from those advantages. So it's therefore right that we convey that if you get into a department, you'll get these advantages, whether or not it's because the management of the organisation is causing it to overachieve, or because there's general privilege around the place because of its history and so on. So it's quite a difficult thing to explain sometimes, but it was my criticism of the TEF because it was trying to do too many things. It was benchmarking to improve the fairness of its assessment of performance and to inform its quality enhancement remit, but it by benchmarking, it reduced its use as a tool for informing student choice. So we are about student choice, so we're therefore slightly less useful as a fair measure of performance and miss some of the context that informs quality enhancement. But that's the price you pay for being just right for the target audience of prospective students. So maybe none of this helps you, me saying that this isn't a measure of performance, because on Monday a lot of you are going to have to explain how the university's done, and they won't care about any distinctions about performance, quality and suitability. So despite banging on about these distinctions, you'll have noticed that I tend to use them quite interchangeably as well. Within providers, league tables are used as a measure of performance, and hopefully in this presentation I'll sort of signal a bit how they can also be used to drive quality enhancement. I suppose my main point is they're not designed for those things. Next takeaway really is don't start with the institution metrics. To illustrate this point, who do you think performs better for career prospects, the London School of Economics or Imperial College? To add to that, I'm going to say that in this year's rankings, we're going to see an institutional average career prospect score of 93% for LSE and 96% for Imperial. So I'll answer for you. You're all going to think that Imperial does better, but you're all wrong, in fact, because when we express this in terms of influence over the institutional provision, that metric is having more of a positive effect for the LSE than it is for Imperial. It's almost twice as large, the positive benefit that metric is given the institution. So the issue here really is that LSE is operating in subjects where the sector means of employment tend to be much lower than the subjects that Imperial offers. So there's much greater scope to exceed expectations, exceed the sector norm, I should say. But both are very close to 100% anyway. So that difference makes a lot of difference. So the fact that the institution metrics don't account for subject mix means that you might well get a false impression of what's positive and what's negative if you just refer to the institution metrics. Secondly, we do tons of work to validate and correct the data that we receive, and we don't use all of it. The institution table generally just uses the straight average that we receive from JISC. None of the changes and adjustments get applied to it. And really, there's no, they don't, as I've said several times, they don't affect institution performance. So you know, you could seek improvements in one thing, it wouldn't necessarily change your overall institutional score. So those are all the reasons not to use the institution table as the starting point for your analysis. But what can it be used for? First of all, I should have mentioned the scores as well. Look, you can use it for tracking performance over time, so you can show your own progress as an organisation. But tip there, don't refer to the scores, because the scores get rewritten each year. They get rescaled each year. They're sensitive to the they're relative to the top and the bottom providers, and the bottom provider can be particularly sensitive. So if the bottom provider is a long way adrift, it changes all the scores higher up in the list. So you'll get a false impression if you try and measure your performance based on whether your overall teaching score has gone up or down. There's an opportunity to show contextual performance relative to peer institutions, and it's also useful for identifying providers that have similar missions and whose performance you'd like to emulate. So you might look at someone and say, well, you know, they're from a similar background, they're doing really well. In what way could we emulate that? So a couple of screenshots here just to show how you might track your progress over time. You can see the story of this institution has gone up very rapidly, tailing off a little bit recently. They might have been tracking this as a performance measure, saying, you know, we'd like to be in the top 30, and for many years they were. They or other providers might indeed track their own performance and say, well, we'd like to emulate that top institution. Maybe our histories aren't that much different. It's not unthinkable that we'd get there too. This sort of context is particularly useful when there's been big changes that affect different parts of the sector. So some people have been in touch with me talking about how this year's NSS results were particularly negative for universities with certain missions. So if you've fallen this year and you're a member of a mission group where lots of institutions have also fallen, that's an important context that you might take back to your executive if they're asking for questions and interpretations about why there's been that change. So there is usefulness in the institutional table. and you'll have to explain it, and showing a good time series can help you tell some stories about that. But generally, would recommend that you get the conversation to a subject level. So show the movements at subject level, try to convey their relative importance, and identify the weak points that matter the most. That's my sort of to-do list of what to work through when trying to offer an interpretation to your executive of what the results mean. So a diagram like this is helpful. It's just a rough summary, but categorizing everything into a quartile or decile really helps, because the number of providers in each subject can be so variable that if you're just providing a straight ranking, you might miss the point. You might be that 6th out of 6 for veterinary science. It's not, it's conveying that as a top 10 position isn't the right way to represent the information. You'll notice here that as well as talking about quartiles, I'm also showing deciles. Why do that? Well, I think I don't have much time to go into this, but I think occupying a place in the bottom quartile doesn't necessarily mean that anything needs to change. It might be a perfectly good place to be. There might not be anything wrong. Bottom decile means that you're in the bottom 10% providers of a subject, and that might be need for more caution, really, and consideration. So this is a good way of trying to give an overview of a portfolio to show strengths and weaknesses and changes year on year. But it doesn't tell you in this example whether health professions is a big subject or a small subject. If you're interested in institutional performance, you're going to know how important that is. So the next diagram has weighted each of those quartile and decile positions by the number of full-time first degree students taking the subject and tracking that over the year. So that really gives you that sense of profile. A successful strategy for this provider was to identify that bottom decile activity was hampering progress for the whole organisation. There was no provider out there that had as much bottom decile activity and was in the top 100 providers, for example. It was a real barrier to go in any further. So for this provider, addressing bottom decile activity was the right place to start. But if you have your own profile, you might have you might set yourself a different mission. So getting that subject detail, I suppose, is the essential message. And if you're being asked about how to improve as an institution, then showing the importance of the different subjects is crucial to doing that. You can go even further, because you'll be getting questions about each metric as well, each data point. So ultimately, you want to get to the point where you can understand the influence of each data point, so you can identify the Achilles heels you have that have greater influence, and might, some of them might be quick wins. From the outset, you have to accept that this is going to be an approximate exercise, because our habit of displaying one thing and using another limits the precision of any analysis you can conduct. But what you can try and do is try and standardize all the metrics that are on display, standardize them with respect to the mean and the standard deviation for subjects at subject level. And then the crucial bit is to apply an appropriate weighting. I've only got 20 minutes left, so I'm not going to go through this slide, but it's just showing basically how we apply those different weightings in an imagined set of metrics, be they subject level totals or metric specific totals for different subjects. You weight those by the number of students taking the subjects. You look at the number of providers. If you've got all of this information, you can just apply these functions to get these sorts of weights. This down here is like the answer. That's like how much whatever this is, whether it be a metric or overall subject performance, whether that's having a positive or a negative effect on your overall institutional position. Well, in this case, it's positive because it's above 0. I'll go through that another time, I think. So as well as trying to calculate this appropriate weighting, you then need to try and the challenge is to display the results and then kind of convince people that those scores, those 0.24s, are actually more helpful and more meaningful as a visualization of performance than the actual tables that are so much more readable. This sort of diagram, if you've got all of those ingredients, if you've weighted every metric in every subject for multiple years, then you can display graphs like this and try and start trying to tell stories from it. So for this provider, you can see over here that the introduction of our continuation metric in 2019 was absolutely disastrous. It coincided with a drop in the Delhi career prospect scores at the time, resulting in the biggest drop we've ever seen in our institution rankings. So as well as leaving you to guess who that provider is, ask yourself whether the relative importance of these two changes here and here would have been as apparent if you'd just been looking at the overall institutional tables compared for 2018 and 2019. It wouldn't shine through from those statistics as much that those were the really important factors. It takes a lot of effort to get a graph like this together, but once you've got it, you can tell a whole lot of stories and really convey the important things. And it's a great foundation for further institutional research as well. So the next step, I'm briefly going to talk through which metrics can support institutional research and what approaches you can take to finding your own truths about your institution's patterns of activity. So getting beyond what we're presenting and just interpreting why we're presenting it and trying to find more detail that we don't know about. It's essential for getting past just explaining and into the what do we do about it part of the analysis. So the first step is to get into more detail than's published. So when you drill into performance areas that have the weakest performance, you might find reporting errors or weaknesses in our metric definitions that mistreat the data. Get into more detail than's published. The starting point should be the preview that's released to institutions from JISC and from HEIR. But ideally, you'll replicate our metrics from your own HEIR returns before we've got hold of them, so that you can see which areas are going to look like low performance, and then you can investigate whether that's fair or not. Drill to the weakest performance, because you might find there something that can be corrected. You might find something that's unfair, and there are some examples. So the coding rules around non-honours awards for non-honours degrees are pretty complex, and there aren't many validation checks in there that will detect and prevent you from misreporting in certain fields. But the first you might see of it is us giving you a really low value added score that's unfair. But if you replicate and drill into the anomalies, you stand the chance of finding that sort of cause that would be fairly corrected. And compare student types. Once you've got these metrics, and if you've built them for your own population, you can bring in other factors. If you're looking at value-added scores, for example, at one of my previous institutions, we started using it to measure the attainment gap between Black, Asian, minority ethnic students and white students, and explaining that difference through value-added scores, which unlocks much more helpful conversations than just looking at the difference in good degree rates, because you can. These are results for the sector as a whole a long time ago, by the way, but you see there is a difference in expectations, which you might say is benign, but there's a much bigger gap in actual proportions that is definitely not benign. And there are other areas that you might look into as well. So understanding the relationships between tariff scores and different qualification categories might show you which categories of student have quite low tariff scores. Similarly, if you look at the continuation indices, you'll find relationships with those entry standards that you might actually do something about. As an institution, you might start addressing how you support students who are otherwise on a course to drop out when they shouldn't. I'm skipping through this fairly fast. This is quite a rich topic that deserves more time, really. Finally, affecting the rankings. This is a slightly sensitive topic because I'm not here to help you improve in the rankings, and it's all relative anyway, and I'm speaking to a lot of institutions at once. But if our league tables can help you identify areas that look weak, and you and your colleagues can do something to improve quality, then that's a good outcome for everyone. Likewise, it's not in our interests to give a false impression of poor quality or poor performance or poor suitability to prospective undergraduates. So if you're able to look into your data in more detail, find the anomalies, identify that they've been caused by a reporting error or indeed a methodology error, we'd like to know and see if it can be corrected in a fair way. So many of you will already be familiar with the opportunities for interaction that we give, so I'll run through them quickly. Have I run through them quickly? I might have skipped a slide here. Oh, sorry, I should have gone through these at the same time. Yeah, so I'd say that yeah, you can use league tables as an external imperative that gets quality enhancement conversations going within your organisation, or it can create an extra impetus for them. But there's an important piece of translation work that needs to be done so that the data is more meaningful internally. That might mean you know, sometimes replicating it using internal data sources. So you'll get it in a more timely manner, for example. So for continuation rates, for example, you'll never be able to completely replicate the continuation rate that we use because you wouldn't have the sector data to support it. But if you replicate it internally, you'll get it much earlier and you'll be able to see the proportion continuing. So replicating it using your internal data sources would give you that advantage. Sometimes you should use a completely different metric. So progression rates as a manageable precursor to continuation rates is a good example of that. And use league tables to really prioritize attention to the areas that need improvement, especially if a small improvement is going to have a big effect. So yeah, this is where I was meant to talk about interacting with the compilation process. We run the mapping exercise. Usually I would have given you months here, but everything's a bit fluid with when we publish. So I'm just talking about the events. There's the DDS preview that JISC or HEIR issue to people around the sector so that they can see the data that we're about to receive and we're able to use. So you have an opportunity to comment and request amendments at that point. Then we release a participation preview of who's going to be in which subject. And we also create a list of non-credible data points where we've signaled that we think data is non-credible and we're not going to use it, or we're going to use a substitution. And you have the opportunity to say, no, it is credible, and we can have a conversation about what it means for the prospective undergraduates who are using the guide. And the course directory is still open now. And you can change which courses get mentioned under each subject. I'm going to move rapidly on into extra methodology detail because some of you will have been anxiously looking forward to this bit, which talks about changes in the 2022 guide. So there are several methodology changes that came in this year. First of all, I mentioned the National Student Survey. There's political change there, as well as anomalous results, leading us to question whether its ability to predict the satisfaction of future cohorts has been impaired. We did consider not using it at all. We did consider using it alone. We felt that, yes, the results from 2021 are indicative of what happened in a pandemic that might never be repeated. So, you know, that might be less relevant to prospective undergraduates, but we felt there was something about institutional resilience in there as well. And yes, it might be a one-off situation, but there might be other one-off situations in future. So we felt that the results should be used. We did actually reduce their weighting from 25% to 20%. Most of the metrics we're using this year are based on HECOS codes as the underlying subject granularity. Nothing to say there, it affected some boundaries a bit. There's no update to the career prospects. We didn't switch to the newer classification either. The continuation index was the one that benefited from the extra 5% that was spared up by the National Student Survey. We started using it in medical subjects as well, instead of the value added score that we'd used there before. That was a better substitution, a better shift in, but it did raise the concern over very tight distributions, which in the continuation metrics looks like, you know, almost all medical students are continuing anyway. So what real differentiation are we introducing here? It was already an issue of oversensitivity in a few other subjects for certain metrics. Go-to example is career prospects in nursing, I mentioned earlier. We felt that there was an oversensitivity whereby if you were a few percentage points beneath the sector mean of 97%, it would be very, very punishing. So we've introduced minimum standard deviations to get around that. So that's the tight distributions reference here. The big change that will affect Scottish institutions is how we handle Scottish hires and advanced hires. I'm nearly out of time here. This is the reason we needed to make the change. You can see on the left here that this is the relative influence of the different metrics categorized by which provider group they're in. Here's the increase in huge benefit associated with the entry standard scores for Scottish pre-92 institutions. The underlying reason is here. The tariff points associated with those categories of qualification are so much higher than almost every other qualification. It was having a big effect already on the rankings of Scottish institutions. Without check, it was going to go up further. So we made this adjustment. We don't adjust anything that's going to be displayed. Those tariff scores are fact. We can't change those. But when standardizing, we are adjusting the mean against which each tariff is compared. We did this for every department. We didn't pick on Scottish institutions, but of course, Scottish institutions do have more students who will have entered with a Scottish hire or advanced hire as their highest qualification on entry. So we expressed for everyone the proportion who had that as their highest qualification on entry. We looked at the overall advantage associated with that entry qualification, and we applied a discount because we didn't want to completely reverse the advantage associated with this, especially as there's uncertainty about what happens in English qualifications during and after the pandemic. So we roughly took the discount factor to a third. So instead of standardizing with respect to the subject mean tariff, every department was standardized with respect to the mean plus their proportion of students with a Scottish hire multiplied by 52 divided by a third. I rushed through that. You might well have questions, but I really wanted to have time for questions. There's only 5 minutes left, so please ask your questions now.
Thanks, Matt. I've captured a few of them. I'm going to go with the ones that got the most likes first. The first is a very practical question. Can you tell us what time the 2022 edition will be published tomorrow? Do you know?
I don't know. It might be the wee hours. If you're up watching US Open tennis, you'll be fine.
Okay, thank you. The next one I was going to ask was about people are asking whether you might in the future extend the use of some of the graduate outcomes questions to include perhaps the graduate reflections as some of the others might.
I liked what the Complete University Guide did this year. I thought that was a pretty good move. And yeah, we should give that some consideration. We have a review group where we do discuss ideas like this.
Okay, and the next one, there's a request for publication of the banding boundaries spreadsheet. Will you didn't do it last year, will you be doing that this year?
I always give it to the Guardian and hope they share it, but I can share it directly with my contacts.
Okay, thank you. And the next one was there was a question about some of the other compilers provide a preview to institutions of the guide. Would the Guardian consider such a thing?
That's the Guardian's call and they choose not to.
Okay. And then just for clarification, I think it's come up a couple of times, as you haven't used the latest graduate outcomes data, can people assume that what was published last year will be exactly the same this year?
Yes. Yeah.
Yep. Right. Okay, they were the ones that I'd picked up. There's probably a few more coming in. Oh gosh, right, they're flooding in now. Let me try and pick some of them up. And lots of, I should have said, lots of thumbs up for a useful presentation. Graduate outcomes are still in JAX until the new data 1920 next year.
Yes, for graduate outcomes, because it's based on the graduating cohort and how their subjects were classified.
Okay, and there's one question here, interesting one. Do you envisage any changes to data collection once the data futures is in place?
Yeah, I mean, it was a massive thing on our horizon that we were preparing for. So far, it's really been only the HEIR change that's affected us. Everything else seems to be permanently on ice. I don't know when it's going to affect us, but it will. Not as much as the pandemic's going to affect all our metrics, by the way. So I'm much more worried about what that does to all the data we use.
Okay, and another hopefully relatively straightforward one. Will the NSS weighting return to 25 next year?
Probably not, given what's happening with the NSS. I mean, it was this time last year. Well, suddenly before Christmas, it was no longer welcome in the sector, according to the DFE, was it? So don't know what's going to happen to it. But it is probably our best metric of teaching quality. So I don't know. I think there's many alternatives.
Okay. Sorry, there's a question here also on Scottish HEIR adjustment. Does that mean that fewer than 5 Scottish HEIs will appear in the top 10 when sorted by institution average entry tariff?
No, it'll mean exactly the same, whatever it was last year, because those are facts. Those are the average UCAS tariffs, and we're not equipped to say that the UCAS tariff is wrong. So we have to accept that data as fact. It's how we handle it in the standardization process that's changed.
Okay. I think we're getting to the end of the questions. Does anyone want to put their hand up if they have posted a question that I have missed? Just trying to get through as many as we can before the sort of formal end time, because colleagues will no doubt have other meetings to go to. Although, as I said at the beginning, Matt did say he's able to hang on for a few more technical questions. Katerina Thompson, I can see your hand up. Would you like to unmute and pose your question to Matt?
Yeah, I really like those two colourful quartile decile visualizations. Would it be possible to have a copy of them?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, they're in Tableau. Someone's asking about the second graph, FPE on X. Oh, okay. Rachel, is there any sort of exit stuff you want to say, just in case people are leaving? And
yes, thanks, Matt, as it is 2 o'clock. So well, really just to say some thank yous. Thank you ever so much, Matt. I think that was a fantastically comprehensive presentation, but really accessible. You've done an amazing job of presenting the real intricacies and complexities of the data. And I think we really appreciate the kind of openness. I think it's a positive aspect of the Guardian Guide of how much engagement you have with colleagues in the sector throughout the whole process. And I'm sure others here will appreciate the time and energy you've put into explaining it to us today. And I really like some of the tips you've given for colleagues to help explain some of these to the executives tomorrow, probably. But yeah, we can thank the Guardian for spoiling some Saturdays as well, I'm sure. So thank you ever so much, and thank you to everyone for joining us. The numbers have stayed over 100 over 2 hours, which has got to be a first. So I think that's an indication of how interested people are finding this. So thank you. And I just want to thank a few of my colleagues at Brighton, Vicky MacDonald, and then particularly Naomi Hepton, who stepped in to help us organise this. I hope there were a few issues at the beginning, but hopefully people sorted that out with rejoining. Thank you ever so much for your support in operating this session, which has gone really well. So thank you all.